to you, Angus. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Just before I start, I got a message from one of the delegates, Mike Danson. So he was having problems getting in. I just referred him to yourself, Sam. Hope that's okay. I think the idea of today's session is that I deal with the first half or so and then hand over to Sarah and Cara. As Sarah mentioned, Sarah and Cara are working for the Glasgow Community Food Network, so I'll let them talk about the Food Network, although I'm very much involved with the Food Network as well. As I said, I've been a solicitor at Castlemilk Law Centre for a very long time. There's about there's 8 or 9 of solicitors here and backup staff. So we deal with Castlemilk in general the southeast of Glasgow. So we try and find problems. Not that they're perfectly easy to find. The problems that people have, and we see if we can use the law to try and deal with some of those problems. So any one year, maybe we got 2,000 or 3,000 clients and issues usually related to poverty, like benefits problems and debt and employment, or housing, like eviction and disrepair and that sort of thing. So the way we get into this issue, really getting into food poverty, was that we were very alarmed at the number of food banks that started popping up around about 2014. I mean, up to then, there wasn't really quite so much of an issue in food poverty, and although people were particularly poor, it wasn't the case that they had to go and get emergency food aid from food banks. So the food banks as a phenomenon really started around about 2013, 2014. So what we did was we went round all of the food banks in southeast Glasgow. And at the time, there were about a dozen or so there, and probably about 50 throughout the city. And the numbers have stayed fairly constant since about that time. So some of them were really quite small scale. It was maybe a church that had a food cupboard, or a local advice agency, or a local a volunteer organisation that had a food cupboard, just helping out maybe people who were asylum seekers in the area. But some of them were really quite substantial. I mean, the big ones that have grown up right throughout the country, and certainly in Glasgow, are the ones that are organised by the Trussell Trust. So there's one in Govanhill, which we found was really quite substantial in comparison with the other ones. So we did an advice session there, and we're still doing that. And the one in Glasgow South East is based in Govanhill there. So they deal with thousands and thousands of people a year now, and it's really been like that for the past 5 or 6 years. So when we were doing our advice session, we were there while the food bank was open. And that food bank's open Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays for 2 hours in the middle of the day, from 12:30 till 2:30. So over the year, we probably took on about 200 to 300 clients who had problems there that we could help them with, nearly all benefit problems. And about 70 to 80% of the people that attended that we could help had benefit problems. And quite often it was disability-related benefits, like employment support allowance or personal independence payments, or other issues like that. So that's the sort of background to it, and we basically found that the benefit system had just been comprehensively degraded over a period, and that's what led us to the thought of, well, what else could there be? So when the pandemic hit, the situation changed quite a lot, although there was still a substantial amount of food poverty. So we thought we should really try and do something about trying to reflect on that and monitor it. So what I've done is I've looked at that whole situation. There's a number of different ways we can look at that. So the first thing I did was, in terms of the issues I was going to deal with, was look at the different contexts. So I'll share the screen on that and bring in there's a PowerPoint I've got there. So I'll keep it on this view, because I want to flip backwards and forwards between some of the different screens that I've got. But the different ways of looking at this whole problem that I've just described is to look at the research paper that we did. I wanted to look at some of the reasons we were doing that and some of the things we looked at. I want to look at the historical context, so look at how things have developed. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time in those two things. I'm going to spend a few minutes, because what I really want to concentrate on is point 3, and look at the experience we had. The experience early on in January 2020 really is before the pandemic really hit, certainly before lockdown. But then look at how things changed during lockdown, especially in the southeast of the city, with the food bank there, and also with some of the things that were happening in Castlemilk at a community level, and then go on to look at some of the legal issues that are there and how we move on from there. But the things I really want to concentrate on are the experience in Glasgow from January 20 to August 21 to the present. The background to the paper. I thought really when we were going through that period from the way things changed with food poverty, with the food bank, and with the way that the community activity changed, I thought that really we needed some way to think about things and take stock and reflect on some of the problems that we'd been facing. So what I did was I went to some colleagues at the university, and I think some of them are here today, so they can maybe tell us their experience of all this in the question and answer session. But what we've done is we've come up with a paper that looks at some of the community responses. The paper that's attached to this session has got 7 sections, and there's really a series of essays, 4 of them done by the students. The first one is, I think it's done by Alex McGee and his colleague, and that's quite a good one because it gives some of the experience that happened in North Glasgow and the West End of Glasgow, but also mentions some of the other issues that are mentioned later in the paper. The second and third sections look at the community response, especially in South East Glasgow. It looks both at how the agencies responded to the needs that they saw in the community, and it also looks at how some of the individuals fared, or at least looks at the changes in regard to people who came to emergency food aid in Glasgow. And lastly, the last 3 or 4 sections of the paper look at some of the legal issues that are relevant, although not necessarily that helpful. So that's the food poverty in those contexts. So just the historical context first, which I'm going to zip over first because it's probably something that we all know. As far as we are concerned, having looked at this issue and worked in this area for now about 6 years, sadly, the problems have pretty much been caused by the introduction of austerity by firstly the coalition government and now the Tory governments that have been there since 2010. Before that period, before about 2012, 13, 14, although we came across clients who were extremely poor, we never really came across clients who were totally destitute, but we started finding that from 2014, 15, 16. And a lot of the clients that we came across who were as badly off as that were the clients who were coming to the food banks. So over that period, things have basically just got worse, and there's been more and more clients who are just worse and worse off. In 2013, the welfare reform that came in from the welfare reform legislation in 2012, that started up. In 2014, universal credit started to be introduced. And it's from 2015 or 2014 to 15 onwards, there was an increase in use of food banks, which I'm going to go into. That changed a bit in last year when the first lockdown came on, with people shielding and people in self-isolation. And I suppose what we looked at really was universal basic services and the comprehensive range of services that came in from lots of community groups in Castlemilk and throughout Glasgow, looking at the food. Second lockdown wasn't quite as bad, maybe because of all the experience we had in the first lockdown. And getting up to date, we've got the vaccination programme just now, and we've got ending restrictions, which in Scotland happened last week, really. So we've got the opportunity to look at what we do now, and I think that's something that we really need to look at much more seriously. So experience in Glasgow during the pandemic. Situation before the lockdown. I've gone over this to a certain extent. I've explained how the number of people started to grow. There is another text that we did, which is called Why People Go to Food Banks, which is a research paper that we carried out in 2014 to 15, which looks at the number of people coming to the food bank in South East Glasgow. So that's on the Castlemilk Law Centre website. But in 2014, I don't know if you know how the Social Trust food banks work, but basically they liaise with lots of community groups in the area, and the community groups like ourselves, they take vouchers from the food bank. So the one in Govan Hill in Glasgow, there's about 200 local agencies throughout South East Glasgow that are in contact or associated with the food bank. So we would give vouchers from them. If clients came to us or any other service user came to another type of agency, we would identify that the client needed emergency food aid, would put some basic information down in the voucher, give the voucher to the client, and the client would then go to the food bank and get an emergency food parcel. I mean, that's at least how it worked up until the lockdown in March 2020. So in 2014 to 15, there was about 5,000 vouchers being given out by the agencies associated with the Trussell Trust Food Bank in Govan Hill. From 5,000, that's gone up to about 12,500. So there's been a huge increase in those 5 years. So there's about 5,000 people been fed through the food bank vouchers 4 or 5 years ago, and that's gone up to about 12,500 last year. Now, what happened at lockdown was that the food bank found that there was a slightly lower demand on them in the period from about April 2020 onwards. So it's quite useful to look at why that actually happened. And we came up with about 7 or 8 reasons as to why there was a reduction in the number of people who were being helped. It wasn't much of a reduction, as I was saying. The number of people being helped was about 12,500. And it went down to about 11,500. I've got if I can maybe unshare the screen and look at the statistics on that for a second. I'll reshare the screen and look at the okay, can everybody see that screen that's got the
We can, yeah, thanks, Angus.
Yep, good, okay. So this is page 24 in the paper that goes along with this session. This is the paper the section of the paper looking at the experiences in South East Glasgow. Now, towards the end of the year 2019 to 20, that is about January to March 2020, there was about 5,000 vouchers been issued by the Trussell Trust Food Bank, and the vouchers that represented to the food bank fed about 12,500 people. But what they found was that there was quarter on quarter, that reduced quite a lot. There's a number of reasons for that, which I'll come on to in a second. But instead, during the past year, or the year from April 2020 to March 2021, the number of vouchers issued went down from 5,000 to just over 3,000. And the number of people fed went down from about 12,500 to about 11,500. So there was a fairly substantial reduction in the number of vouchers being issued, but a fairly negligible reduction, about 8% in the number of people being fed. So just to go back to the PowerPoints. We looked at the reasons for that. Now, there were some quite interesting reasons. There's always been a fairly substantial number of referrals, maybe not referrals, they didn't want to call it that, but the DWP used to signpost people to the food bank. Now, what they used to do, as I say, it's mainly a voucher system. So if somebody came to us, for instance, we'd give them a voucher with their name on it, and they would take it to the food bank. But the DWP didn't want to give people vouchers. They didn't want to take people off benefit, give them a voucher and send them off to the food bank. So they used to just give people a letter confirming that their benefit had been reduced, and then they would take that to the food bank. But when this was a bit a point of conflict between the DWP and the food bank, so eventually the food bank said that they weren't going to do that anymore, and so they said to the DWP, either give people vouchers or don't send them along. So that was one reason why that the numbers possibly reduced. Going back to 2015, there were about 2,500 vouchers in total, feeding about 5,000 people. 500 of those, or 500 of the referrals or signposting, came from the DWP. By the time we got to 2019, about 700 of those came from the DWP. So they weren't actually vouchers, but they were letters from the DWP that were presented by people coming to the food bank. So a very large percentage of the people coming to the food bank has had their benefit reduced by the DWP and went straight to the food bank. In addition, in regard to benefits, there was a £20 increase in universal credit that we all know about. So that probably helped a fair number of people, and probably people who were on the sort of age, who could maybe afford a wee bit more. That enabled them not to have to go for emergency food aid. So that's probably another reason why there was a reduction in demand. Again, there was a number of groups affected by the pandemic. Although there's about 200 groups, when you categorise those, there's 6 types of group who take up the majority of those. So there's housing associations, there are advice agencies like ourselves, there was the DWP, there's people helping asylum seekers and migrants, there's people in the social work department. But one of the main groups who send people along and issue vouchers are the churches. So that some groups were affected by the lockdowns. For example, the churches, and they couldn't quite, they weren't able to meet and congregate. So there was a substantial reduction because of that as well. The food bank at the very beginning, when they locked down, a lot of people there were a lot of the volunteers that ran the food bank. There's only really one or maybe 2 paid workers. Everybody else was volunteers. So they were at risk, and they had to shield themselves. So again, there was a reduction in access, and instead of being open 3 days a week, in the March, April, May time, they were only open 1 day a week. A lot of the groups, like housing associations, arranged to go and pick up food parcels, and there was an increase in emergency food outlets, and there was a change in demographics. The reduction of 1,000, the net reduction in that relates to maybe 1,200 adults reduced, not a reduction in the number of adults to 1,200, but an increase in the number of children of about 200. So that really accounts for the overall reduction of 1,000. So a quite steep reduction in the number of single people attending, but an overall increase in the number of families attending. So that takes us to the reduction in the demand on the food bank. What also happened, though, as I was saying, there's a reduction. There was an increase in the number of food outlets that were helping. So a lot of the agencies, a lot of the voluntary organisations, a lot of the charities around the city, they really massively increased the number of things they were doing and the work they were doing. In Castlemilk, there's a group called Castlemilk Together, which is an association of about 30 or 40 groups and community activists that are working just in Castlemilk. So they did a huge amount of work. A lot of housing associations, a lot of childcare organisations, a lot of youth groups, senior centres, football groups, just a whole range of people. There's people working for the council and social work or community development, people working in NHS. So a lot of those groups really expanded what they were doing and worked together even more effectively than they'd been before. The senior centre, that they started cooking meals themselves and actually taking them out to some of the pensioners that used to come in to them, that they couldn't do that anymore because of lockdown. A lot of the housing associations, they used to send folk down, send a lot of their tenants down to the food bank. Instead of doing that, they would go and collect the food parcels themselves from the food bank, bring them back to Castlemilk and give food parcels out to tenants themselves. So there was that substantial change, but that resulted again in less activity at the food bank, but overall more emergency food activity. So while there was a lot of different food activity going on, a lot of the agencies that became even more active than they'd been before, especially a lot of the food agencies. So Cara and Sarah will talk about the Glasgow Community Food Network shortly, but as well as the Trussell Trust food banks, there was a fairly substantial number of other food agencies. So the non-Trussell Trust ones are organised around a group called IFAN, which is the Independent Food Aid Network. So a lot of those groups working together come up with a campaign called Cash First. And that basically says that instead of having to depend on emergency food aid, people should have enough money to pay for the basics. So not just food, but also enough money to pay for fuel, for gas and electricity, enough money to cover any rent that they've got to pay, because housing benefit doesn't cover all of the rent in a lot of cases, and for other basics. And that wasn't happening. That's really why there's been such a high demand on the emergency food outlets over the past 3, 4, 5, 6 years. People have only got a limited amount of cash coming in. Some people don't have any cash coming in at all. So they maybe pay for gas and electricity, keep the lights on, and they've got to go to the food bank to get some emergency food aid. So the Cash First campaign is really to try and deal with that. And the idea is that people should have enough basic income to cover them for their basic needs. And that really hasn't been happening. And the degradation of the benefit system over the past 5 years has just worsened that. And it's made it absolutely essential, absolutely necessary to work on an alternative to the current benefit system. That gets me to where we are just now. As I was saying at the very beginning, the sort of thing we do as a law centre is to try and identify the problems people have in the communities. We don't deal just with Castlemilk. We also have offices in Tory Glen, and we have offices in the Gorbals. And as I say, we work in Govan Hill at the local food bank there. We look at the problems people have, and we try and find legal remedies for them. And to be honest, we're really successful in that. And almost everybody that came to the food bank, we could sort their problem. It's just that it was going to take some time. So if they were taken off benefit for the DWP, if their benefit was reduced, if it was all disability-related benefits, in the UK, that's employment support allowance, it's universal credit, and it's personal independence payment. Usually what was happening was people were having their benefit reduced, and because of that, they had to seek emergency help. And we could deal with all of that. It's just by the time you apply to the DWP to get the benefit back on and ask them to review it and then go to a tribunal, it's 5 months down the line or longer. And so in the meantime, people still have that emergency need. And it's fine saying we can sort the problem. It's just that we can't sort the problem there and then. And there are, as you'll see in that slide that I've got up there, there are a lot of relevant legal provisions. But if in the paper, the conclusion that the authors have reached in that is that they're not really helping that much. There's a lot of human rights that are there. There's the economic and social and cultural rights, though. So the source for them is an international covenant that the United Nations brought in 1976. And there is a right to food in there, and that the UK has signed up to it. But it's not those rights aren't in the European Convention on Human Rights. Like, they're not the ones you can enforce. The ones in the European Convention on Human Rights are the civic rights. So you can enforce rights to a fair trial. You can enforce rights to rights to privacy, rights to not being tortured, all that sort of stuff. But the economic, social, and cultural rights are the ones that relate to food, and they're not ones that are enforceable. There's that's covered by the section 5 in the paper. Section 4 in the paper deals with what's called a food systems approach, or a community food systems approach. There's a Good Food Nation bill before the Scottish Government just now, or the Scottish Parliament. It's not really going anywhere. The idea is that you produce provisions and services that can provide good food for everybody. But if you look at the Good Food Nation Bill, all it does really is commit the Scottish Government to having, if they're having a statutory framework, then they look at bringing in commitments to looking at food issues as part of that. That's not very effective. The Glasgow City Food Plan just came in last month, and that's a bit better. See if I can look at that fairly briefly before I finish. If I can stop sharing for a second on this, and that's the Glasgow City Food Plan there. I mean, what it does, it comes up with a 10-year project. But the first thing it mentions in its food plan is food poverty. So food poverty with fair food for all is the primary thing. It includes ourselves and the other advice agencies in Glasgow and giving help to people. And it's hopefully a document that we can use and give effect to over the next 10 years or so. But it is long term. It's not going to all work tomorrow. We just have to work out how to do that and make it work over the next period. It's again a food systems approach, and it's hopefully going to work, but it's not going to work tomorrow. The last thing is enforceable social security, and really that's just a reflection that the social security that's there with universal credit is, if anything, causing the problems we've got just now. And the amount of services that had to come in to help people after lockdown, especially from March 2020 to June 2020, it showed the lack of support that was there financially for people. And although that didn't come in quite as much again in November, what we need to do now, I think, is look at how we can make the social security system better, which brings us to whether or not we should bring in a universal basic income now, which is section 7 in the paper, and it's which what Sarah and Cara are going to speak to. So I'll just stop sharing the screen here and hand over to Cara and Sarah.
Oh, we can't hear you, Sarah.
Is that better?
Yay!
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Angus. Hi, everyone. It's great to be chatting to you today. Cara and I have been attending so many discussions and workshops on basic income over the past number of months, and I almost can't quite believe that now it's our turn to present some work to you. So thanks very much for the opportunity. So Cara and I are from Glasgow Community Food Network. We're a community interest company established in 2017 to bring together people working with food, and that's everyone from chefs, food bank volunteers, market gardeners, restaurants, you name it, to kind of then develop a flourishing food system in Glasgow. We want to see a city where high quality, fresh, local, organic produce is available and affordable for all, and where good food is a celebrated part of our culture. So for the past 13 months, we've been working on Glasgow Community Food Network's Community Response Project. We focus on the themes of dignity, partnership working, sustainable supply chains, and food and income insecurity. The issue of food insecurity, one that has long existed in Scotland, was hugely exacerbated during the coronavirus pandemic. With an extremely high number of job losses, vulnerable and elderly people shielding, and many unable to navigate the complicated benefit system, calls for help were at an all-time high. When our project began last July, we started by scoping and mapping the ways in which communities responded to food insecurity during the pandemic. And in January of this year, we then turned to looking beyond emergency response to longer-term solutions. And while we've been supporting community groups and organisations, we have often met reports of It's not food poverty, it's just poverty. This is a reality faced by over 1 million of Scotland's inhabitants. In a recent UK-wide study by the Food Foundation, 55% of those experiencing food insecurity said it was because they did not have enough money for food. So we see in the first instance, if people were paid enough to live, they would not be forced to use emergency food provision services, which are often undignified, difficult to access, culturally exclusive, or dietary inappropriate. So we began further looking into approaches such as independent food aid networks' cash-first approach to food insecurity, providing straightforward resources for people facing financial crisis to quickly see available advice, cash-first support options, and which local agencies are best placed to help. So simply put, helping get money to people who need it. And we found that universal basic income echoed this same principle. The premise is in the name: regular, non-means tested payments to everyone in society, designed to allow freedom, choice, and agency in all areas of life. Universal basic income is not a new idea, and a strong movement is present here in Scotland with many groups dedicated to the campaign. And pivotal to our research into UBI were workshops carried out by Strathclyde University's economics professor Matt Smith, which analysed impacts of a basic income on mental health and well-being, guided by mental health and social care professionals, people with lived experience of mental ill health, benefits recipients, and UBI advocates. And alongside our basic income research, in May, Cara and I decided to run some participatory action research sessions with local community members. Participatory action research involves working with members of the community to understand and resolve community problems and empower community members. And the idea for this came about the first stint of our project when we were scoping community response to food insecurity. And we noted that really community voices were distinctly left out of the design and decision-making of local food provision services. So often treated with contempt and viewed as burdens, in reality, community voices and users of emergency food services are the very voices we need to listen to most. They are experts by experience. They are actively engaging with the issues they're experiencing, actively understanding and recommending solutions. So the aim of our project really was to get service users direct feedback and honest opinions on local food providers, and then use this information to influence local change. Our belief is that generating diverse, honest conversations about food in communities can lead to direct actions. So we wanted to centre participants' assets, the changes the community can make to underlying causes of food insecurity, and to equip participants as activists in their own right. We then hope to build local leadership, ensuring participants can be part of the future design process for adequate and dignified support. As our sessions progressed, our participants wanted further feedback from others in the local community who had used emergency food services, so they created a public survey. When we collected the responses, we noted that every single person who had used a food bank said they would rather have received cash in that instance. As one comment revealed, "I don't prefer any of the food providers. Food vouchers and cash money is best." So I'll just read out a couple of the survey findings to you. Over 80% of responses revealed people were not always comfortable at food provision points, stating, "They always ask me lots of questions before serving. There are no choices. I feel embarrassed to queue for food, and people ask for lots of personal information." We had 50% of responses saying the food they receive is not enough, 66% of people saying they were offered no choice, over 50% saying they do not use all the food they receive, commenting that the food was not culturally appropriate. And at the end of these workshops, our participants had drawn up a list of recommendations, which we are now compiling in a report, which will be published and passed on to local government and policymakers with the hope of vastly improving these services. And the recommendations that our participants came up with for local and national policy centred on 5 main pillars, and they were better food education, increased choice, more dignity, better coordination across food services, and finally the biggest one was focus on cash first approaches. So really we need to move away from depending on food banks and emergency food aid and kind of firefighting, because as we can see, the use of food banks is extremely stigmatised. There's little dignity or respect, and there are many access barriers. So with such a demand for cash first response, it really makes sense that implementing a basic income is a way to approach this. And I'm now going to pass over to Cara, because she's going to talk about another area that's extremely stigmatized, full of barriers, and working in a less than adequate way, the universal credit system. Over to you, Cara.
Thanks, Sarah. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Yes, I'll just going to go over some of our findings from our research paper. So yeah, like Sarah says, the universal credit system is incredibly stigmatised, and actually the Economic Affairs Committee found that the design of universal credit is leading to an increase in claimants needing to use food banks and also struggling to pay their rent. So across the UK, inquiry reports really condemn Britain's universal credit system, deeming it unfit for purpose. And further to this, the Fraser of Allender Institute presented results that indicate 280,000 people and a further 90,000 children would be lifted out of poverty if the lower level of basic income was implemented from the Scottish feasibility study. Whereas universal credit could reduce overall poverty by 170,000 and child poverty by 100,000 only if the benefit cap and the two-child limit were lifted, while at the same time increasing the main child payment from up to £40. So the cost of running universal credit is drastically lower than UBI. I think it's around 4 billion compared to 7 billion for UBI. But there's also a lack of nuance here. So when considering food and income insecurity, there's much more to it than just alleviating the financial costs. UBI reduces the stigma and exclusion often experienced by those living in poverty. The complex, humiliating bureaucracy under universal credit could be replaced by something much simpler. So under UBI, you would not need to give detailed, intimate accounts of your personal circumstances when you need to access cash or when you're at your most vulnerable, or provide evidence to be able to do so you can feed your family, for instance. We witness the way universal credit systematically dehumanises people and does nothing to look after those who are in need. UBI, in contrast, would prevent poverty by creating a nationwide safety net. Further to this, as seen in the SNP's 2021 manifesto, a minimum income guarantee has been sought out. However, we believe the steps laid out by the Scottish Government to a UBI pilot need to be taken as priority. The minimum income guarantee suggested by the Government does not go far enough in addressing financial insecurity, in our opinion. Although any income maximisation should be supported, means-tested benefits are not the way forward, in our opinion, at GCFN. A minimum income guarantee would only provide payment to those who need it, which would be based on independently assessed circumstances, meaning people who are still forced to navigate complex bureaucratic setups before being considered for help. Minimum income guarantee could lead to the same issues and stigma as the current universal credit system. So in our belief, why swap one flawed system for another? For instance, under a minimum income guarantee, there's still no way forward to give those living under no recourse for public funds and income, but this could be included within a UBI programme. UBI as an alternative offers unconditional universal payments that can be administered efficiently and reduce the barriers created by this administration. Further to this, there's so many other benefits of UBI, especially for those who are unemployed and facing food and financial insecurity. For those living in poverty, alleviation from stigma, insecurity, destitution, homelessness, exclusion, and material deprivation would be significant. As First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says, implementing basic income will grant people both dignity and opportunity. There's a strong argument to be made for the increased health and well-being achieved by UBI. Being able to make choices about what food you eat and where you buy it from, and having the finances to make those choices are so important. By providing a safety net for people, we can create widespread positive change across Scotland. Our communities could become healthier, happier, more creative and independent. And also the benefits that work to alleviate poverty directly impact food insecurity as well, as mentioned by Sarah earlier. A basic income grants people the financial resources to eliminate food insecurity for themselves, their families and their wider communities. Families with stable and extra income from UBI would be able to afford and access both more food and food that is nutritious, healthily and locally grown. So it seems we're at this precipice of fundamental change within our system where we can actually choose to value people's lives, not just as workers, but seeing their inherent worth as people instead. However, there's still many unknowns to UBI in Scotland. For instance, what happens to wages, rent prices, and pensions, in particular for those who are disabled, carers, or have extra support needs as well. There are loads of really complex questions that need to be answered, and this is really essential that we do answer them in order to tackle head-on these questions in order to reassure the public and ensure UBI not only becomes a reality, but is really available to work for everyone in our communities. UBI really isn't a silver bullet, and in our opinion at GCFN should in fact be part of a series of measures. For instance, rapid increases in social housing, housing reform, financial education, guaranteeing a living wage, redesigning our public transport system to be green and affordable, maintaining solid social infrastructure and land reform, just to name a few. These universal basic services would work with UBI to form nationwide wraparound support. And with this in mind, UBI could be part of a common good that benefits everyone in Scotland and enables us to share our resources among each other. So what are we doing at GCFN just now? So it started in February, and with the expertise and support for Basic Income Network Scotland, as well as the UBI Lab Network, we helped set up a local working group called Glasgow Universal Basic Income Conversation, also known as GUBIC. Hello to all my GUBIC members who are here at the moment. And GUBIC held a virtual hustings event and an open Q&A session with 6 Scottish Parliament candidates, as well as over 70 attendees earlier in this year. This initiated a dialogue between political candidates and members of the public about the benefits of trialling a new social welfare system, with candidates consequently pledging support for UBI at the end. This has now actually been realised, with parties across Scotland exploring basic income within their manifestos, which includes the SNP, Scottish Labour, ISP, Scottish Greens, and the Scottish Lib Dems. Further to this, GUBIC are exploring methods to forge Scotland's way forward with UBI, and as a group and a movement, we're actually growing. So using a toolkit created by the Basic Income Conversation, GUBIC would like to hold discussions around basic income in the future, enabling us to embed community voices into the heart of the matter. So through this, we can encourage and co-create community-led research, which the aim of that would be to redistribute power, leading to services by the people of Scotland being designed by and for them themselves. Further to this, in June of this year, GCFN joined forces with UBI's Lab Network to create a UBI Food Lab. A UBI Lab is a citizen-led group seeking to explore and advocate for a universal basic income, with groups themed geographically or by lived experience. The UBI Food Lab will discuss and research more widely the impact UBI could have, in particular on those facing food insecurity. This merges 2 of our most focused on project themes at GCFN and has provided excellent opportunities to network, share knowledge and continue campaigning for UBI trials in the UK as well. In Scotland this year, 108 candidates from all parties signed a Hollywood pledge for UBI, and actually 29 went on to win seats in the May 6 election and will carry this pledge forward. During this year's televised leaders debate, 4 out of 5 of the main political party leaders backed UBI as part of Scotland's future. SNP's manifesto plainly states their interest in pursuing a UBI pilot, with the case being immeasurably strengthened by the pandemic, according to Nicola Sturgeon at First Minister Questions. Despite Holyrood not having devolved powers over tax and social security, their steps towards securing a basic income in Scotland are clear. So seemingly the time is now for UBI in Scotland, and the topic is becoming increasingly mainstream, with polls suggesting 2/3 of people in Scotland support the introduction of basic income. As members of GUBIC, UBI Labs and GCFN, Sarah and I are part of a nationwide lineup that works to build stronger connections on UBI throughout the country. We have already asked, is it time to try UBI at our hustings? And the answer was a resounding yes. Now we must focus on turning this into reality, and that's what we will be doing. So thanks everyone for coming along. That was just a little bit of our research paper. Actually, there'll be more in-depth research published this autumn with GCFN from our COVID response report, so watch out for that. to stay updated with that, you could probably follow us on Twitter. Our handle, I think, is GCF Network, I'm sure, on Twitter. And yeah, you should follow UBIC as well. And we're at UBI Glasgow on Twitter. So you can follow us along there to keep updated. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming along today.
Great. Thank you so much to Cara, Sarah and Angus. What I'll do is quickly, I'll just stop the recording of the session